As the enormous hull of Titanic was moved to the fitting-out dry dock from the gantry on the River Lagan, the crowds began to wane. The launch of the vessel was a complete success on all accounts. Now, the real work would begin. All the months prior had provided the workers in Belfast with a skeleton with which to build on, but now they needed to fill it with its appointments. Looking overhead, the ship had very large cavernous holes in her top decks, which led almost right down to the keel. These spaces were left open intentionally, for the installation of large equipment, like boilers, her turbine, and the two massive reciprocating engines. The foremost uptake would also be transformed into one of the most iconic symbols ever built on an ocean liner, the Grand Staircase. It was customary on Atlantic liners of the period to have a main first-class staircase as a means of allowing for easy travel for the most distinguished of passengers. But due to the inclusions of large landings on each level of the staircase, it allowed for first-class ladies to make an entrance and call attention to themselves as they entered the room, the likes of which could be seen in most formal social halls and banquets. Truly a first for an ocean liner. Adorning the staircase from above would be a massive 19-foot by 26-foot wrought iron and illuminated glass dome. An intricately carved clock mantle representing honor and glory crowning time would be installed on the topmost half landing. The largest landing of the grand staircase would be the D-deck reception room. This proved to be a popular staple on her older sister Olympic, so much so that Titanic's reception room was slated to be expanded to allow for more passengers to enjoy their time there before and after meals. The room had proven so popular on Olympic that some passengers had taken to sitting on the grand staircase itself to enjoy their time there, something which White Star sought to remedy immediately. Directly aft of the reception room would be the first-class dining room. Like the reception room, this space would span the entire width of the ship and was 113 feet long, nearly 10% of the entire ship's length. The room featured a Jacobean-style ceiling and a completely white setting. Leather-padded chairs were to be found at each table, and unlike other liners of the time, the Olympic-class dining chairs, at least in first class, would not be bolted to the deck. Passengers were free to move them during a meal to make themselves more comfortable, something that was practically unheard of for a ship of the time. One odd adornment to be found in the dining room and other first-class areas would be the floor decorations. A rather new invention for the age, linoleum tiles were to be fitted in most of the first-class spaces, as they were found to be very popular. Further aft on B-deck would be another option for first-class passengers to enjoy their meals, without all of the formality that went along with a 9-course dinner, or being served only at certain times of the day. The a la carte restaurant. This feature had been adopted by White Star after one of their rivals from a German line had installed Ritz-Carlton-run restaurants in his ships. They had proved enormously popular with high-paying customers, and White Star would have nothing but the best, so they included these as an option for their first-class members. Decorated in French walnut with intricate carvings adorned with gilded moldings, ornaments, and a Vaux rose Axminster carpet, the design of the restaurant evoked the Louis XVI theme. Other rooms to be added would be a gymnasium on the boat deck, her first-class lounge, a swimming facility on F-deck, Turkish baths, reading and writing rooms, smoking rooms, and many others. All of these features lay bare as Titanic was maneuvered into her dry dock, empty steel decks waiting for her craftsmen to transform her into the largest and most lavish ship in the world. If her older sister Olympic was to serve as any form of blueprint for the expected time of completion, Titanic would be ready to set sail in nearly 8 months. In reality, it would take nearly 10. As the workers began their task of transforming Titanic into the ship of dreams, her older sister Olympic was taking part in her own maiden voyage across the Atlantic to the New World. Thomas Andrews was on board and began to take notes both from crew, passengers, and his own thoughts for improvements that could be made. A perfectionist to his core, Andrews documented a great many changes set aside for Olympic in her first refit, but the benefit of having Titanic in an incomplete state meant that these changes would be implemented immediately. Mattresses in the first-class cabins were to be upgraded with new bottoms to prevent vibrations from the ship's engines. Cigar holders would be installed in some of the first-class bathrooms. In some sea-deck cabins, the full-length mirrors attached to some of the cabin doors were to be removed. This was to prevent a passerby outside of having the chance to see the occupant inside the cabin if the door was slightly ajar. Changes in ventilation configurations were made after notes from Andrews were taken about certain spaces on the ship becoming rather warm and stuffy during the summer months. Without question, the most exhaustive changes were to take place on B-deck. It seems that the promenade decks were deemed excessive on Olympic, with it featuring an enclosed promenade on B-deck and an open promenade on A-deck. At some point, the decision was made to remove Titanic's enclosed promenade on B-deck entirely and expand the cabins there, as well as install newer ones that would be even more luxurious. 2 of the to-be-included cabins would be the parlor suites, each comprised of 2 bedrooms, a private bathroom, a formal sitting room, and each would have their own private 48-foot by 13-foot promenade. The first-class restaurant on B-deck would also be enlarged to eliminate the port-side promenade, while the starboard side would boast an entirely new feature found only on Titanic, the Café Parisien. All the changes to Titanic's B-deck had not only made her capable of carrying more passengers, but it had eliminated the only enclosed promenade deck space on the entire ship. To counteract this, the forward half of her A-deck promenade was now slated for enclosure, so the first-class passengers could have a private and shielded promenade. A bulkhead door was also to be installed at each forward end to protect them from high gusts of wind while at sea. The officers' quarters would also be expanded towards the bow ever so slightly to make room for newer first-class staterooms forward of the grand staircase. This change meant completely rearranging the rooms inside of the officers' quarters and the shifting of the Marconi room from the exterior to the center of the ship. Small changes were made as well, to the wheelhouse, for example, which on Olympic had been curved, but altered to be flat on Titanic. Bullseye lights were also to be installed on the bridge for protection against broken glass in the bad weather, a suggestion by Captain Edward Smith himself. All the modifications made to Titanic from feedback taken while Olympic was at sea would result in the higher square footage of enclosed space, giving her a higher gross registered tonnage over her older sister. Titanic would now be the largest ship in the world. One feature of the ships that had been originally planned to be revised, but ultimately was never touched, was the lifeboats. When the design of the ships was underway by Alexander Carlisle, Harlan and Wolff had anticipated a revision of the British Board of Trade regulations and had designed a new Welland-type davit system for the lifeboat stations on the Olympic class. This would allow for 64 lifeboats to be carried and would allow space and seats for everyone on board. White Star and Harlan and Wolff both agreed that a change in the regulation would only be a matter of time, due to the size of the ships increasing with each passing year. It was best to err on the side of expecting this change and installing these new type davits capable of handling 4 boats per station. History would prove otherwise, though, as the time came and passed for the British Board of Trade to update their regulations. White Star therefore included 4 additional lifeboats over what the law dictated. A law which had been enacted nearly 20 years prior to Titanic's construction. Tests needed to be made on all of the machinery components going into the ship before they were installed. This meant the fabrication, assembling, testing, disassembly, and then finally a reassembly inside the ship after the installation of her massive reciprocating engines and turbine. Titanic's 3-story tall engines would be supplied with steam from 29 boilers. Each piece had to be carefully moved from inside the machining shed, lifted over the ship with a massive crane, and gently lowered into place via the large uptake holes in the ship. Once all the machinery had been installed, the uptakes could be made, which would feed the exhaust from 2 boiler rooms each, up and out through one of the ship's most recognizable features, her funnels. Wooden walls were erected inside the ship to serve as boundaries for the workers inside. Each morning a worker would be assigned to a specific section of the ship. They would show up to their assigned station and stay within the boundaries until their shift was over. Next came the paneling for the walls. Authentic wood was used, which has since fallen out of favor due to risk of fires. In first and second class, much of the paneling in the public rooms would have to be carved by hand, giving the rooms an opulent feel and making each panel totally unique from any other. After the wall paneling was in place, the tiling, carpeting, painting, staining, furniture installation, lighting fixture installation, and all of the many accoutrements were brought on board. Work continued at a steady pace, and it seemed as though the mighty ship would meet her maiden voyage date on schedule. But a series of events were about to take place which would postpone both the work being done to Titanic and her maiden voyage from January to March of 1912. As RMS Olympic was leaving Southampton to begin her 5th voyage across the Atlantic, she suffered an accident. The cruiser HMS Hawke had been steaming alongside the Olympic for a short while. At some point, the small ship began to pull ahead of Olympic, just as Captain Smith ordered for their speed to be increased to 16 knots. The sudden churning of the waters caused a suction to take place, and it pulled the Hawke to port, towards the starboard side of Olympic. Both ships ordered their helms to perform evasive maneuvers, but nothing could be done in time. The Hawke pierced Olympic's side, near the stern, as the two ships collided. The Hawke, a military vessel, which had a reinforced bow meant for ramming ships, suffered a completely crushed bow. Olympic suffered much greater damage. Her sides were torn open in 2 large gashes, causing 2 watertight compartments to flood. Debris from the collision was also thrown into the water, which in turn collided with Olympic's still-turning propellers, damaging the starboard propeller in the process and mangling her propeller shaft. Neither ship suffered enough damage to be at risk of flooding, which is remarkable. Both ships were able to make it back to port under their own steam for basic repairs and the offloading of passengers. Olympic returned to Belfast on October 6, 1911, and a full set of repairs were done to make her fully operational by November 20th. This also afforded a rare opportunity for a photographer to capture a moment in history where the 2 superliners were reunited in the same location since the date of Olympic's launch. Olympic would once again return to Belfast for 6 days in March of 1912, after throwing a propeller blade and needing a light repair. Due to Olympic's misfortune, Harlan and Wolfe were forced to postpone the delivery date of Titanic to White Star, which had pushed its maiden voyage back from the originally planned January of 1912 to April. By late March, the ship was nearing completion, and the first vestiges of her crew began to arrive. Chief Officer William McMaster Murdoch, First Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller, and Second Officer David Blair all arrived in Belfast on March 20th, 1912. They were there to familiarize themselves with the size of the ship, which they would surely need, as no other ship in the world was the size of Titanic, other than Olympic. First Officer Murdoch had an advantage in this sense, having been previously appointed to the Olympic, but both Lightoller and Blair had never been appointed to a ship of this size. March 27th saw the arrival of even more crew, with 3rd Officer Herbert J. Pittman, 4th Officer Joseph G. Boxall, 5th Officer Harold G. Lowe, and 6th Officer James P. Moody, and other members all reporting to Murdoch as the ship drew ever nearer to the date of her completion. 2 people that could be seen on the ship at this time were neither under the employment of White Star, nor were they workers of Harlan and Wolff. John George Phillips, Jack for short, and Harold Sidney Bride were employed by the Marconi International Marine Company, and they would be responsible for sending messages over the state-of-the-art wireless apparatus on board. Officer Murdoch saw to it that the ship was thoroughly inspected by his crew while the ship awaited her delivery to White Star. Officer Lowe and Moody were ordered to inspect the starboard lifeboats and make sure that all the equipment was in working order. Officer Pittman and Boxall carried out this duty on the port side. Francis Carruthers, employed by the Board of Trade, also arrived near this time and began to inspect the ship, as he had already done over 1,000 times during its construction. First Officer Charles Lightoller accompanied Carruthers on this inspection. They saw to it that the lifeboats were examined, loaded with weights, lifted from their chocks, swung out, and then lowered to the ocean, and raised back up by the steam winches on deck. March 25th also saw the arrival of Titanic's first commander, Captain Herbert James Haddock. Having been recently transferred from the Oceanic, he was to oversee the completion of Titanic and await for the arrival of the Commodore of the White Star Line, Edward J. Smith. More crew also signed on the 25th, including Quartermasters Arthur J. Bright and Alfred Oliver, lookouts Frederick Fleet and George Rowe and Archie Jewell, lamp trimmer Samuel Hemming, purser Reginald Barker, Chief Steward Andrew Latimer, Steward Edward Wheelton, Gymnasium Instructor Thomas W. Macaulay, and Deck Engineer Thomas Miller. Finally, the morning of Titanic sea trials dawned, April 1st, 1912. Captain Edward J. Smith took command of the vessel, and Herbert Haddock departed Belfast to take command of Olympic. The trials had to be postponed on the 1st due to high winds and very choppy waves. But beginning at 4 a.m. on April the 2nd, firemen in the stokeholds began to breathe life into the furnaces of Titanic's boilers. Galley crew began to prepare the first meals to be served on board the ship, and black smoke began to waft from the massive ship's funnels. Thomas Andrews also joined the ship that morning with a very special group of people from Harlan and Wolff, the Guarantee Group. These men had helped to build the Olympic-class ships, and they were personally selected by Andrews to join the ship's maiden voyage to guarantee that everything ran smoothly. It was an extremely desirable appointment, as it showed that their hard work and commitment had paid off, and they had a very bright future ahead of them at Harlan and Wolff. The group, William H. Campbell, Alfred Cunningham, Anthony Frost, Robert Knight, Francis Parks, and Enos Hastings Watson, were sent to their assigned stations for the trials. By 6 a.m., the mooring lines were released, and her flotilla of tugboats guided Titanic safely towards the open waters of the sea. Spectators lined the shores of Belfast Lough as the ship moved towards the open waters. Everyone was immensely proud of their new creation. Finally, the time had come. The tugboat lines were let go, and Titanic began to move under her own power for the very first time. Francis Carruthers from the Board of Trade saw to it that the ship performed up to the standards of the British government. She would need to gain his certification, or else she wouldn't be approved to carry passengers. After many hours, Titanic was granted her certification. Good for 1 year, and the enthusiastic crew headed back to Belfast by 6 p.m. As the workers of Harland and Wolff exited the ship that they had spent 3 years building, they bid a fond farewell. A quick provision of supplies were brought on board before Titanic cast off once more, this time at 8 o'clock in the evening. From her home waters of Belfast, her journey would take her to Southampton, where she would eagerly await her departure date of April 10th, 1912. White Star and Harland and Wolff had done the impossible. They had produced not only the new standard of shipping going forward for years to come, but they had taken their original design, improved it, and bested the competition in nearly every aspect of shipbuilding. All that remained to be seen now was the maiden voyage of the Ship of Dreams.